Next on Brute Force, the history of weapons at war. They risk their lives to keep the troops supplied. Over the hump of the treacherous Himalayas and onto the cratered runways of Kaisan, they fly the world's largest planes to hand-deliver the guns and butter that win the war. Without them, an army will die. They are the captains of Airlift, throwing a lifeline from the sky. Next on Brute Force, the history of weapons at war.
Switching 124.1, descending to 10,000, and we'll maintain to 300.
These American pilots are about to fly their jet transport unescorted into Russian airspace. Not too long ago, this would have been a suicide mission met with a hail of Russian surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery. But today, no missiles threaten this C-141 and its crew of the Air Mobility Command. Instead of delivering a shipment of bombs, bullets, or paratroopers to supply an army at war, this jet fills its 100 feet of cargo space with a more peaceful load. Tens of thousands of jars of baby food.
You help out whoever needs help. The 50,000 pounds of baby food that we've got, I don't know, maybe it'll make a difference, you know. Maybe they have a future scientist or something like that, or one of these kids that's going to get this food. So it's one of those things you never know. But for us, the overall goal is to get the cargo to the people that need it.
151, you are below. Glide path wheels down and gears clear to land.
151, thanks.
Whether they bring ammunition to a combat zone or food to a disaster area, for those on the ground, airlifters provide a lifeline from the sky.
Taxi to the runway, then make 118, and vacate runway, taxiway 2.
Roger, sir. 180 exit, taxiway 2, 151.
Landing military aircraft from the United States on a Siberian airfield called for close cooperation between former enemies. This special airlift mission brought more than food. It also brought something less tangible, but just as important to these people: hope.
I think it's great. I think we're doing a good job here, trying to help out another country. I feel good about it. It seems like they're appreciative of it, even though we can't understand what they're saying.
This donation was organized by the Catholic Relief Services Organization for hungry children being cared for in small clinics and hospitals across thousands of miles of Siberian wilderness. The Air Mobility Command offered the only means of getting this humanitarian assistance from the United States to this isolated region. To these airlift ambassadors, the Russian governor sent a personal message.
I wish you prosperity. I wish you and your family's happiness and good health.
But the care shown by the crew of this mercy mission is no different from what's expected of them every day in the Air Mobility Command.
Even when the world is essentially at peace, that we're doing our combat sort of mission day in and day out, whether that's going into Sarajevo or into Somalia. We take a great deal of pride in being able to do that every day. The pride, I think, is essentially the same, whether that's getting the bombs and bullets on target or whether that's getting the rice and flour to the starving children. Our history has been that that sort of operation, the humanitarian one, is one that we're particularly suited to do in peacetime, and we've carried out that sort of mission time and time again.
For decades, airlifters have flown emergency relief to regions devastated by natural disaster in the United States and around the world.
The crews know that getting the rice or the flour or a medical team into a country that's been devastated by a disaster is a great challenge, and one that we expect them to use all of their skill and all the airplane has to accomplish. Airlift is an essential element of our warfighting capability. It's also an essential element of our ability to make peace something everyone in the world can enjoy.
The work to improve airlift capabilities began after World War I. Despite budget cutbacks in 1923, the Army Air Service invested its meager resources into expanding the role of air power. Two aviators, Lieutenants John McCready and Oakley Kelly, prepared to make the first non-stop coast-to-coast flight of the United States in the T-2, a transport plane built by the Fokker Company in the Netherlands. At the time, no American-built aircraft could meet the difficult requirements of a transcontinental flight. In preparing the plane, 780 gallons of gas were pumped aboard the single-engine aircraft. By flying east to west, the two Army aviators hoped to use up most of the heavy fuel load by the time they tried to climb over the Rocky Mountains. For McCready and Kelly, this was no stunt, but part of an Army program to develop better planes and advance flying techniques. The Fokker began its journey on May the 2nd. Laden with extra fuel, the 10,000-pound aircraft barely cleared the trees at the end of the airfield. Flying around harsh weather to avoid unnecessary turbulence, the crew flew at an average speed of only 94 miles an hour. 27 hours later, the T-2 had covered the 2,250-mile distance and safely touched down at Rockwell Field, San Diego. By covering the greatest distance ever made in a cross-country flight, McCready and Kelly proved that in a national emergency, Army troops or supplies could be transported from one coast to another in a little more than a day. In the winter of 1932, the Bureau of Indian Affairs asked Army air crews for help in getting food and other supplies to the snowbound Navajos in Arizona. Wrapped tightly in blankets and attached to bomb shackles, the crews loaded the food and medicine as if they were slinging high explosives in the bomb bay. B-2 Condor bombers of the 11th Bomb Squadron from Marchfield, California, flew into Arizona to deliver the bundles. At 133 miles per hour, in open cockpits, at freezing temperatures, the pilots searched the mesa until they found the isolated Indian lodges. Flying low, the pilots approached the snowed-in areas as if on a bomb run. The makeshift Mercy bombs had worked. Agents of the Indian Bureau reported that by dropping over 15 tons of food and supplies, the bombardiers turned airlifters had saved many Navajo families from certain starvation. The demands for airlift evolved faster than the technology until the Douglas Aircraft Company unveiled the DC-2, an aircraft built for the commercial airline industry. First flown in 1935, this all-metal monoplane boasted an unprecedented cargo capacity and range. The DC-2 would evolve into a weapon of legendary stamina.
Lifeline from the Sky will continue in a moment here on A&E.
The German Luftwaffe led the Nazi blitzkrieg across Europe in the fall of 1939. The technology and power of the Reich rolled on unchecked. By 1940, the German juggernaut had reached Paris and began to prepare for the invasion of England. Great Britain, with her war industries already at maximum output, came to the United States for vital war material.
We shall send you in ever-increasing numbers ships, planes, tanks, guns. That is our purpose and our pledge.
It was decided through the Lend-Lease program that we would provide aircraft to England to help them out. And to do this, of course, the aircraft had to be moved from this country over to England and Scotland. So the organization that was tasked to do this was called the Air Corps Ferrying Command. It was established in May 1941 with the specific purpose to fly aircraft over to England for their use.
From May until December of 1941, the crews of the Ferrying Command flew over 1,300 planes of many different types across the Atlantic to Great Britain. Under the Lend-Lease agreement, this new command was also authorized to deliver aircraft and supplies to British forces fighting in other parts of the globe. The Air Corps pilots who pioneered routes all over the world as they shuttled planes to foreign armies would soon use these same air routes to supply American soldiers. Not long after Roosevelt's declaration of war, women pilots were trained to fill in for men who had shipped off for combat overseas. The 1,000 flyers of the Women's Air Force Service Pilot Program were largely responsible for the success of the Ferrying Command.
The command actually lasted barely a year when in 1942 the Air Transport Command was established to support the war effort for the United States and the Allies.
The supply network of the Air Transport Command spread like a web over all theaters of the war.
Have 5 C-47s stand by to load special cargo.
Prepare to load 4 B-24s with rush cargo for Special Project 302.
Cargo for Special Project 302 will be delivered at airport at 1640 EWT.
The cargo for Project 302, like every other heavy load moved by the Air Transport Command, depended on aircraft that were not originally designed for the job, but modified for the airlift mission. The plane found to be best suited for hauling cargo was the C-47. Given the official name of Skytrain, it was more commonly called the Goonie Bird.
The early cargo planes actually were converted commercial aircraft. The DC-3 became the C-47. The C-47 has a legend of its own, of course, because it came into being in the late 30s and is still operational throughout the world right now in the 1990s.
In mid-1942, the Air Transport Command had 5 overseas wings delivering planes and supplies. It ran shipments through the North Atlantic, the Caribbean, the South Atlantic, Africa, and the Pacific. Essentially, wherever the Allied forces recaptured territory lost to the enemy, the ATC soon followed. During World War II, the ability of a transport aircraft to deliver a fighting force onto any battlefield in the world changed the nature of warfare. Paratroopers dropped over their target by unarmed cargo planes could quickly reinforce a beleaguered army or launch a surprise attack. C-47s dropped troops in 14 major airborne operations. The Air Transport Command and the C-47 made a significant contribution in another war, the war for survival. The aerial evacuation of wounded soldiers increased their chances of survival. That critical period between the time of the wound and the start of treatment was drastically decreased by the airlift forces. Aerial evacuation would become the most welcome morale boost offered soldiers at war. Air Transport Command's first sustained airlift operation began as the Allied armies struggled to force the Japanese out of China.
So it was determined that the only way that the people could be supported, the forces of both Chinese and American, would have to be by air.
We kept China alive from 1942 to 1946. China needed everything. They needed arms, they needed food, they needed ammunition, they needed gasoline, they needed everything. And they figured the only way we could get it there was to fly it over what we now call the hump, the Himalaya Mountains.
Supplies needed in China were first brought to India, where they were loaded aboard the cargo aircraft. From Assam, India, the missions flew northeastward over the Himalayas and landed in southwestern China, often at the American base at Kunming.
Flying the hump during World War II was at least as dangerous as any combat mission in Germany. When you consider the capabilities of the aircraft and the route they had to fly over the Himalayas.
The aircraft that bore the brunt of the hump airlift was the Curtiss C-46 Commando. ATC sent all available C-46s to India.
We called it Dumbo. It's so nicknamed after the Disney's flying elephant, because it looked like a flying elephant. It was a huge airplane.
The crews knew that each mission into China would set them up against many adversaries, Japanese fighter planes, jagged mountain peaks, and their most deadly enemy, bad weather.
It was the most dangerous air route in the world. If you were caught in an updraft, your altimeter would just spin, and you would go 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 feet in a few seconds. And then conversely, you'd hit a downdraft, and the altimeter would spin the other way, and you'd go down 6,000, 8,000 feet in a blink of an eye, it seemed like. On occasion, when you stopped all the spinning, you found that you were flying upside down. So you'd have to apply, rudder, aileron, and kick it right side up. It would turn us completely over.
We were as low as 12,000 feet, and we were as high as 20,000 feet. We had no control to where we were at.
Once in a while, you'd come up out of a valley and up to the top and into a cloud, and you'd go, oh my God, now what? You'd go into the tightest climbing spiral you could to miss the mountain that you know is there in front of you. They always said those clouds are stuffed. They're hard. If you fly into a cloud, you're liable to fly into a mountain.
The airlift cost the Air Corps 792 men and 460 aircraft. The high number of losses earned the air route a telling nickname, the Aluminum Trail.
The jungle was so deep that you could crash an airplane into the jungle and there would be no sight from the air because of the density of the jungle. And it was just solid, continuous green mass.
I was lucky. I had the same number of landings as takeoffs. Exactly the same number. A lot of guys weren't that lucky.
I was 21 years old, and I guess I was too young to be scared. How a young guy is, they know everything. They're not afraid of nothing.
At that age, nothing can happen to you. You just figure you can handle anything. I did. I was cocky as hell. It hurt, however, to see guys go down.
Flying the hump was ultimately a very great success. It was the precedent for the whole airlift concept up to this present day, being able to transport supplies over long distances to forces when they cannot be reached any other way.
Improvements in airlift techniques and technology were not limited to the Allied air forces. The German Messerschmitt 323 could lift more than 22 tons of cargo, more than twice the amount any American plane could carry. The unique layout of its cargo compartment simplified the loading of large vehicles, a feature sorely missed on Allied transports. Two 7.9mm machine guns in the nose and two mounted behind the wings provided protection for the four-man crew. This Leviathan first flew in 1940 as a glider. In a system known as the Troika Schlepp, 3 bombers pulling together would tow the plane into the air. This configuration proved impractical, and soon the Me-323s were fitted with 6 14-cylinder radial engines. Its slow cruising speed of 140 miles per hour and immense size made it an easy target for Allied fighters. On one disastrous mission, 14 planes out of a flight of 16 were shot down in a single attack. This captured German footage shows an Me-323 delivering troops and equipment to the Russian front. The transports also supported combat in the Mediterranean and in North Africa. By the end of the war, the Luftwaffe operated 198 of the giant transports, the largest planes to fly in combat in World War II.
Lifeline from the Sky will continue in a moment here on A&E.
Berlin, the jewel of the Third Reich, lay in ruins at the close of the Second World War. The city crumbled between two armies. The Allied forces entered from the west, and the Soviets attacked from the east. Although deep in the Soviet area of occupation, control of the Nazi capital was divided between the Americans, British, French, and Soviets. Each country governed a sector of the city, with the largest portion falling into the hands of the Russians. By 1948, reconstruction of much of the city had returned hope to the population. The city was still dependent on the outside world for its food and fuel. The different military governments ensured that goods and services necessary for survival reached the Berliners. But without warning, on June 26, 1948, the Soviets severed the lifeline to Berlin. They halted all highway traffic and trains bringing supplies to the city. The Soviets never affirmed the Western powers' right to access to Berlin. With resupply impossible, the Russians planned to starve the Allies out of Berlin.
The Soviets were confident that we did not have the airlift capability to supply the people isolated in Berlin by air, certainly for a very long time.
The Air Force immediately sent transport planes to supply Berlin. But a new aircraft would replace these veteran C-47s.
The C-54, first and foremost, had greater cargo capacity and had greater range. So it improved the capability of the airlift. C-54 became the workhorse of the crisis in Berlin.
The Skymaster, a significant improvement over the C-47, entered the Allied inventory near the close of World War II. The airlift had enough planes, but desperately needed pilots.
I went over to Germany. I walked in the operations office, and there were a lot of guys there that I knew, of course. There were airplanes sitting there loaded with coal, ready to go to Berlin, but no pilots. I walked in the door, and within 30 minutes, I was sitting in a C-54 on my way to Berlin. I had 2 round trips that day before I was released and told to go find a bed and come back in about 12 hours and do it again.
The airlifters loaded everything required for the survival of the men, women, and children of Berlin. But on 190 missions, Colonel Herman flew but one cargo: coal.
Coal was used to keep the bakeries going. The bakeries went full bore because everybody was on bread and milk, so to speak. And the coal came from the Ruhr Valley, and it was loaded into 110-pound bags. The displaced persons loaded the aircraft, Czechs and Poles in West Germany. In Berlin, it was Germans primarily that unloaded it. When we landed, the flight mechanic would go back, untie all the ropes, and open up the 2 big double cargo doors. A truck would follow us down to our parking spot. The truck would back up, they'd throw a coal chute up, and a bunch of Germans would climb up in the airplane and start unloading, dropping those bags on the chute down into the trucks. It took about 20 minutes to get 10 tons of coal off. As the last few bags were being unloaded, 4 or 5 German women would climb up in the airplane with brooms, dustpans, shovels, and some sacks. When the last bag went out, we'd close the rear door and start the engines and taxi to the end of the runway to take off to go back to our base. The women would sweep the airplane down from front to back, every little bit of coal. And as we got to the end of the runway, a truck would pull up, we'd put a ladder up, the women would climb down the ladder into the truck, we'd close the door, and we're on our way back to our home base. We flew with the windows escape hatches out in the airplane to keep the coal dust from accumulating, because it's coal dust highly explosive. But the airplanes got really dirty, and we did too. After flying 3 round trips to Berlin, you look like you'd worked in a coal mine all day, because you'd be just covered with coal dust.
Coal dust became only one of the many hazards of flying supplies over East Germany. Air traffic control directed the pilots to maintain their flight paths along one of 3 narrow air corridors leading into Berlin. The Soviets signed over this precious airspace to the Allies when the city was divided in 1945.
These corridors were 20 miles wide. No Allied aircraft were allowed to fly outside of those corridors. Now, the Russians were all over the place because that was Russian-occupied territory all around. And we were told by intelligence and so forth that we could expect that perhaps the Russians would shoot us down. We flew over hostile territory and landed at airfields entirely surrounded by hostile territory.
To maximize the limited airspace, the Military Air Transport Service devised an intricate plan.
All the aircraft flew 3-minute intervals and 500-foot separation in altitude. Airplane at the same altitude would be 9 minutes ahead of you. And you could see, sometimes you could see half a dozen airplanes strung out ahead of you. We used to refer to it as kind of a loose formation. We flew very specific airspeed. Going in, we flew 170 mile an hour exactly, and we maintained our intervals that way.
Radar stations in West Berlin helped maintain a rhythm that safeguarded the planes from mid-air collisions.
Maintain your present elevation and continue vector 315. Begin your rate of descent at 500 feet per minute. Azimuth is good, elevation is good. Take it over, Baker George 2. It's all yours from here.
With one plane landing every 3 minutes, Operation Vittles brought over 2 million tons of food, fuel, medicine, and clothing into Berlin. After 12 months of non-stop flying, the will of the Soviet Union shattered, and they lifted the blockade. On May 12, 1949, the Soviets reopened the rail lines and highways from the west into Berlin. A bottom line paid for with the lives of 28 Air Force crewmen.
It was the first time that airlift was used as an instrument of national policy. The Russians were not successful in forcing the Allies out of occupied Berlin.
Colonel Herman did not hesitate to answer the call to duty, even when asked to risk his life to save the lives of former enemies.
These were just civilians, and we were trying to keep them alive. And for 15 months, we kept 2.5 million people alive in Berlin. We had a mission to do, and we succeeded. You get a real good feeling that you've done something for humanity.
Lifeline from the Sky will continue in a moment here on A&E.
Unexpectedly, on June 25, 1950, communist-controlled North Korea invaded its American-supported neighbor to the south.
The armed invasion of the Republic of Korea continues. I am proud to report that the United States is prepared to furnish assistance to the Republic of Korea.
The United States, which already had a small military force stationed in the country, came to the aid of the South Koreans and began to send combat troops and material to the distant peninsula. The Cold War had become a hot war. With its few C-47s and C-54s, the 374th Troop Carrier Wing flew elements of the 24th Infantry Division from Japan to Korea. These soldiers deployed along the thinly defended Busan perimeter, the last remaining stronghold of the Allies on the southern tip of Korea. The Military Air Transport Service lacked sufficient aircraft to meet the demands of the forces now locked in a desperate struggle. Within a week of the invasion, the Air Force chartered 60 civilian airliners to augment the shipment of supplies across the Pacific Ocean. Soon, these civilian carriers would be shuttling 40% of the cargo reaching the war zone by air. Once the equipment and troops reached the theater of operations, the Combat Cargo Command assumed responsibility for getting the gear to the battlefield.
You have strategic airlift that flies the equipment from one theater to the other. Once the equipment, the cargo, is in theater, then it's the mission of tactical airlift to take it to the front, to take it to the battlefield area. During the Korean War, most of the airlift support was of a tactical nature.
To airdrop supplies, MATS depended on an aircraft originally designed for civilian cargo transport. The C-119 was the first American plane to include a feature found on Germany's huge World War II transport.
The C-119 had the big clamshell doors in the back. You could load up on the ramps. They had the ramp up there, and you could load up through the back end of the airplane. You could handle loads that they couldn't get into these other airplanes. The C-119 was really the first aircraft that could be loaded that way. It was a good airplane.
By October of 1950, the Combat Cargo Command had gathered enough C-119s to conduct the first major airdrop operation of the war. For the first time, large amounts of cargo and troops would be dropped together. 71 C-119s loaded 2,800 troops of the 187th Regimental Combat Team and 300 tons of their supplies for airdrop 30 miles north of the North Korean capital of Pyongyang.
We've dropped just about everything you can think of out of the 119. We did drop quite a few paratroopers in on certain missions where they needed to hold an area or reinforce it. The airlift was a great part of the war effort. It's the only thing that really kept them resupplied. Korea is rather mountainous and rather inaccessible in many areas, and the airlift sometimes the only way to get in and also the safest way.
The Regimental Combat Team landed between the retreating North Koreans and their sanctuary to the north. By day's end, the soldiers had secured the drop zones and strategic highway intersections. The next morning, 40 C-119s delivered an additional 1,000 paratroopers and 100 tons of equipment to the battlefield. The 187th linked up with United Nations troops moving north and killed or captured about 6,000 North Koreans. Since the battle lines never stopped shifting, airlift constantly moved, inserted, and resupplied troops all over the country. By the time a truce stopped the fighting in July of 1953, air planners recognized the value of an improved tactical airlift aircraft.
A specific airlift aircraft was needed, designed for the job, capable of providing ground support tactical airlift requirements, capable of taking off on a relatively short runway, landing on a relatively short runway, and configured to carry the necessary cargo to support military operations. And the aircraft that ultimately evolved from this kind of a requirement was the Lockheed C-130 Hercules.
Boy, I said, that's what we've been looking for. We've been flying underpowered aircraft and airlift for all these years. All the specs on it just sounded fantastic. Well, that was the biggest thing I had ever seen. It was a big monster. It's a funny-looking airplane on the ground, but in flight it's just beautiful. Crews very nicely, it's comfortable, air-conditioned, pressurized, and at low level it just worked beautifully. It handled so easily.
The remarkable stability of the C-130 while flying close to the terrain inspired a new delivery system called LAPES.
LAPES is a low-altitude parachute extraction system. It involves flying the aircraft very low to the ground with the gear extended in case you should inadvertently touch down. And then the load is extracted as you pass either over a prepared dirt surface, or sometimes the load will actually be delivered onto a runway surface itself.
The war in Vietnam put great demands on the airlift fleet. But nothing would test the skill of the airlifters like the resupply of the Marines trapped at Khe Sanh.
In Khe Sanh, they were in real serious trouble, and we had to run continuous missions in there to keep them supplied. The jets were dropping napalm right alongside the runway while we're coming in to land. They're trying to keep the area clear for us. In Vietnam, you never knew who really owned the runway anyway, particularly at night. The Viet Cong were all around the field, and they even beyond the field, you never knew. They had one procedure of speed offload. That usually it's because you didn't want to be on the ground too long, and so you get down to one end of the runway and accelerate, and they all roll out and sit on the ground, and you go down and take off again and get out of there as fast as you could.
From January until April of 1968, Air Force crews flew 1,100 sorties into the besieged garrison. 1,200 tons of ammunition and food helped the defenders repel constant attacks by the North Vietnamese.
We lost several airplanes. Often they were hit on the ground, too. In fact, the ground people used to call them mortar bait. As soon as the 130s come in to land, why, that's when all the mortars start coming.
You never think that you're going to die. You're extremely focused on the airdrop itself because you know if you don't provide a stable platform to get things out on target, then all you're going through will have been for naught. You would have put yourself and your crew in a dangerous situation, not delivered the goods and not gotten them to the folks that need to get them.
To the 2 battalions of Marine Corps infantry at Khe Sanh, the air bridge meant the difference between life and death.
Tactical airlift, I think, because of its very close relationship with the ground troops, can always make a tremendous difference. You're resupplying folks both physically and mentally. Knowing that somebody's going to come get you out and that fresh folks can get in to relieve you, I think reduces a great deal of the combat fatigue. They knew that we were bringing something that they need or coming there to take them away from that situation. I think from that point of view, they were always happy to see us.
Lifeline from the Sky will continue in a moment here on A&E.
During the long war in Vietnam, the principal role of airlift changed dramatically, shifting to a greater emphasis on direct combat support.
Virtually every aircraft asset that could be gotten to theater and utilized for a particular role was during Vietnam. Vietnam placed a tremendous requirement on every aircraft that we had in our inventory. But during Vietnam, we had the development of the C-141, the Starlifter, which basically was taking the C-130 Hercules cargo area, expanding it slightly and putting 4 jet engines on it. So it was the first jet-powered airlifter in the United States inventory.
Small flaws in the airframe and avionics systems were detected during the testing phase in 1965. By the time the Air Force received the last of the 284 Starlifters in 1968, the deficiencies had faded. The plane's performance during Vietnam ended any further criticism.
In 1969, the next airlift capability entered into the force with the, at that time, somewhat controversial C-5 Galaxy. Its cargo capacity was about 3 times the C-141, so its capability of transporting cargo from one point to the other enhanced the mobility of the U.S. forces tremendously.
In 1966, Congress directed that MATS be redesignated MAC, Military Airlift Command, and placed on an equal level with the other Air Force combat commands.
Near the end of the war, in '73, the release of the POWs brought MAC to prominence. I think we all remember the POWs getting off of the C-141 and the wives and children not even waiting till they cleared the tarmac, but running over to meet them. You couldn't help seeing the image that MAC had made in this humanitarian effort. It was clear MAC had a role that superseded the battlefront or superseded war MAC could get people out of dangerous areas or even areas where they had to be transported better than any other force. MAC started becoming known as the world's airline.
MAC has always been a responsive and valuable tool for the successful execution of American foreign policy. After a coup by leftist elements in the Caribbean nation of Grenada in 1983, MAC began airlifting American and Caribbean troops to that tiny island. MAC transported close to 16,000 tons of cargo and 36,000 passengers between October 25th and the end of December. The airlift operation ranked as the largest in recent history. Within a week, soldiers of the 75th Infantry Division and the 82nd Airborne had silenced enemy opposition.
We conducted an air mobile assault and rescued 233 Americans, which were on the far side of the island.
During Operation Urgent Fury, MAC evacuated 709 American civilians and 164 wounded soldiers back to the United States. The airlifters also hauled 755 Cuban prisoners from Grenada to camps in Barbados. In the winter of 1989, MAC again answered the call to arms. Soldiers based in the United States were ordered south to join Allied forces already in Panama to protect American lives, place in power the legitimate democratic government, and bring General Manuel Noriega to justice.
Now, flying into there and getting shot at for the first time was a whole different experience for me, but it's not like you really felt you were in any danger at any time. You just went in and got the job done and got out.
At H hour, on December 20th, Airlift forces and Army paratroopers joined in the largest night air drop since World War II. With the airfield secure, other C-141s could land Army Rangers and strengthen the attack.
Going down there in an actual combat situation, delivering troops and supplies in there, and looking at the faces on the troops that are going down there and thinking that some of these guys might not ever come back again, it really hit home. It really makes you think about what you do for a living.
Noriega's army and poorly trained security detachments could not repel the invading force. On January 3rd, 1990, he surrendered to agents of the Drug Enforcement Administration. Ironically, the same airlifters that came to destroy Noriega's dictatorship carried him safely to federal prison. Only 7 months later, pilots and crews of the Military Airlift Command began the largest sustained airlift in the history of warfare.
During the buildup of Desert Shield, tensions were really high. Here we were up against the fourth largest military power in the world at the time, and we were expecting quite a fight.
The possibility of chemical or biological warfare was something that concerned us a great deal. The primary thing that we expected to take out were, of course, casualties.
Fortunately, the coalition forces suffered only a fraction of the anticipated casualties. Specially rigged C-130s did evacuate wounded troops, but oftentimes they were Iraqi. To ensure victory, the airlift demanded teamwork.
If somebody drops the ball, then the mission doesn't move at all. So it's definitely a team concept to move the mission.
If we can't do our mission and our job to get the needed supplies where they need to be, the war wouldn't have been fought. We are the bombs that were dropped. We're the food that they eat out there. We are the ground troops' ammunition.
We lay the groundwork for everything. I mean, without us, the people who get the glory, the fighter guys and the bomber guys, wouldn't really be able to do their jobs. There's no way that they could fight any sustained conflict without us.
The McDonnell Douglas C-17 will continue the tradition of projecting military resources in a crisis or assisting in humanitarian missions at home or abroad. The C-17 will begin active duty in 1993 and serve as the backbone of air mobility well into the 21st century.
Tomorrow, meet the cowboy who never met a man he didn't like. The story of Will Rogers on an all-new time machine. Then, has killing become commonplace in our culture? Bill Curtis examines violence in the media on an all-new investigative reports. Now stay tuned for A&E's An Evening at the Improv next.